Welcome to the Materials and Inventories video module in the Simulation-Based Planning and Scheduling course. And this is video 1, where we will do a module overview and the objectives. And we will also briefly review the material from the previous lecture. So in terms of our objectives, I said, we're going to briefly review this material. If you haven't watched that lecture, you should definitely stop this video and go back and watch that, because we're going to pick up from where we left off there after a very, very brief review that I'm going to do here. Then in video 2, we're going to introduce the use of the material and inventory elements in a really simple supply chain model. And then finally in video 3, we're going to illustrate 3 utility concepts that are related to materials and inventory, and we're going to use these concepts later on. The first one is something called a constraint logic element. The second one is using a transfer node to route to multiple servers in parallel. And finally, we're going to look at moving the bill of material information from the material elements into a data table. Okay, so in last lecture, we introduced the material and inventory elements, and we noted that material elements are used to represent discrete consumable resources where we don't need any animation and we don't need to have the overhead associated with entity instances. And so essentially it's just keeping a count of available inventory. When we introduce inventory elements, then they represent storage buckets or actual locations, physical locations in your model for holding stocks of specific material. So in a factory model, I might have one inventory at a production line, another inventory in a warehouse for the same material. And both of these elements, material and inventory, support replenishment through multiple replenishment policies. And so you can see I have just a couple of screenshots here for the material element widget. I have a continuous review period with the reorder point, reorder quantity policy, and that reorder point, reorder quantity policy has 2 parameters, the reorder point and the reorder quantity. And then we execute the replenishment process through a semio process. And in this case, we have a really simple one where we simply produce the widget. So we produce the widget to the corresponding inventory. And the overall replenishment behavior implements something that looks like this. We have essentially, it's triggered by the policy in the review period, and information about the replenishment is written to the token material order detail. We then specify some sourcing policy or modifiers in the process logic. And then depending on what general type of model we have, if we have a supplier model, we are then consuming inventory or consuming material from an inventory at the supplier. If we have a manufacturing model, we are delaying for some length of time where I am modeling the manufacturing process. And then after I do the consumption or the production delay, I then produce the corresponding material in the target inventory. So that's kind of the general replenishment behavior that we saw. And then we ended that lecture with an example model where we had one material, a widget, and 2 inventories. We had a manufacturing inventory and we had a warehouse inventory. And we were consuming the material from the manufacturing inventory and replenishing from the warehouse model. So we built this model and discussed the basic concepts of the replenishment policy and that kind of thing. And so in the next video in this module, we're then going to pick up and do a much more detailed supply chain model that describes the use of these inventory and material elements in some amount of detail.